I used to own a small Halloween-themed shop. It's located downtown in a fairly small city, and unlike many businesses in town after Walmart's arrival, my store never really suffered when it came to customers. Of course, it was only open for the month of October. I sold a lot of unique things you might find at other novelty stores in bigger cities, but for cheaper prices. I really didn't do it for a profit as much as I did it to celebrate the spooky Halloween spirit. I also love to celebrate that spirit by doing my best to scare the crap out of people every Halloween. One particular Halloween, my chosen victim was my buddy Alex. He was a pretty relaxed and calm guy most of the time, so he was the perfect person for the plan I had in my mind. First, you should know that I always began packing up my store every Halloween fairly early in the morning, as it was unlikely to get customers on the holiday itself. I had told Alex that I had much heavier merchandise that year and could use help moving it all out. Not knowing what he was getting into, he accepted, and I told him to meet me at the shop at 10 at night, sharp. As I said, Alex was a relaxed and calm guy most of the time. Unfortunately for him, he had once told me about his irrational fear of clowns and how he could not function around them. So, naturally, my plan involved dressing up in a clown costume. When he arrived at the shop, I would stand perfectly still like a statue. Once he realized he couldn't find me, he would then call me, most likely. But when my phone rang, it would be in the pocket of an apparent clown statue, and when he came over to investigate, I'd give him my best scare. Pretty simple plan, right? Everything was set in motion. I dressed up, stood near the back of the store obscured by some boxes and other decorations, and waited for his arrival. A little after 10, Alex entered. It was very dark, as I'd made the last-minute decision to cut the lights before he arrived. He called my name a few times, but of course I didn't respond. I heard him walking around a bit, looking around the shop for me. I could barely hold back laughter. After a bit more shuffling, I heard Alex speak in a defensive tone. Not funny, dude. I looked around, but there was definitely no way he could see me right now, even if I had twitched or anything. I continued to play dumb. Come on, man, he repeated again, sounding angrier this time. That's not funny. Confused, I quietly adjusted a nearby stack of boxes so I could peer through a crack towards his voice. I couldn't make out his shape very well, but I knew for sure he was not looking in my direction. Suddenly, my phone rang. I heard Alex turn toward the sound instantly and I froze, giddy with excitement that my plan was working. But as he approached, I realized he wasn't holding his phone, and a wave of disappointment fell over me as I discovered my prank had been ruined by another call. Alright, fine, you got me, I announced shortly after the phone stopped ringing, taking off my mask and stepping out into the open. But Alex's face didn't look relieved. His face twisted in such horror that I had never seen before. He began yelling and spouting panicky words, and I spent a few minutes trying to get him to calm down. He explained to me that when he entered, a man in a clown costume had stared at him and began walking slowly towards him, but when my phone rang, the man had dashed right out of the store. Alex had no idea that I was actually hiding in the back the whole time. I don't want to think about what would have happened if Alex had showed up late that night, or if my other buddy had never called during that prank. This happened during my college's Halloween celebration a few years ago and is the most terrifying experience of my life. One of my roommates, some friends, and myself let to go to a party around dusk, and we were catcalled by a group of 3 drifters or homeless people. We thought nothing of it and went on our merry way. About 4 hours later, we were going back to our apartments to change shoes when one of the drifters called out to me. "Hey beautiful, how about a kiss?" Me, being a little drunk and sassy, I reply, "No thanks, girls are more my type." To my shock and horror, he says, "Hey, my friend here likes the ladies." A homeless girl comes out of nowhere and proceeds to kiss me on the mouth. My friend picks me up and throws me over his shoulder. I proceed to flip out in my apartment. I shrug it off, and we venture back out. Well, later on, I got separated from my group in the crowd, and then I see the three drifters again. I try not to show that I'm shitting bricks when they ask me where they can find a liquor store. I point down the street to Kroger and they say, "Okay, can you show us?" I'm a small woman, and they shoved me into their vehicle. I think, naively at the time, that they will literally let me out at the grocery store, except it's closed because it's after midnight. I plead for them to let me out of the car, but they keep saying, "The power does what it wants," and headed away from the safety of the campus area, onto the freeway, and out of the state. For the next 4 hours, I visited 3 states with them while pleading for my life. I'll never forget how they kept saying, "The power does what it wants," and talking about how they're going to have fun with me. I kind of resigned myself to the fact that I was going to die, that I would never graduate college or see my family again. They pulled into a gas station and I slipped out of the vehicle to be grabbed again, but I screamed my head off for the clerk to help me. That's when they talked about taking me to the cliff. I mentioned that my family is full of police officers and they're probably already looking for me, how they're committing a federal crime, and that I won't press charges if they take me back to campus. I guess that's when the girl started to feel sorry for me because she started to say, "Guys, she's really scared. Maybe we should drop her off somewhere. This doesn't have to get any worse." They took me back to the campus area, and as soon as the girl pulled me out of the car, a police officer called my name. The girl shoved me toward the cop and yelled, "The power does what it wants, and tonight it lets you live." I've never been so happy to sit in a cruiser. They pursued them, but I don't know if they were ever caught. My roommate dropped out of college and joined the military, and I transferred to another school. So, ladies and gentlemen, please be careful walking at night. Always keep your cell phone with you if possible, and call the police if you see suspicious people near your apartment. I had a brush with death that day, and I am so grateful for the time that I have now. This could have been written better, but it's honestly hard to talk about. Halloween has always been my favorite holiday. Spooky themes invading our homes, false cobwebs spanning window corners, and jack-o'-lanterns gazing onward with their silent, crooked grins. You'd think that after all that's happened, I would dread the oddly perfect combination of orange and black, that the sight of fallen leaves on the ground would only further serve as a cruel reminder of what's never left my waking mind. I love it still, and I will love it this final year. My story begins shortly after my 14th birthday. Craig drags me through the musty aisle of yet another antique shop. Bored out of my mind, but also amazed our small town has so many of these weird stores. I was sick of wasting our weekends riding our bikes across town looking for something we might not ever find. Sitting through water-damaged books, porcelain knickknacks, dead people's furniture, and rusty farming tools. Who wants a rusty sickle, and why does every shop have them? Craig had been forcing me to check these places with him for the last 3 weeks, ever since our friend Tom told us about this book he found while shopping with his grandma. A month earlier, Tom's grandmother took him antiquing with her, and he was just as miserable as I was now. In one of those shops, Tom found an old leather-bound book filled with symbols and what he thought were songs. He sat down and carelessly flipped through the yellow pages while he waited on his grandmother to browse another whole store at the pace of a wounded elephant. Tom stared off and let the loose pages slip past his fingers in their musty procession. Then, she was shaking his shoulder, telling him it was time to head home. Tom said he felt groggy, as if waking up from an insufficient nap. He incredulously read his watch and found nearly half an hour had passed. He recalled none of it. Tom told us his story at school the next day. I just assumed he fell asleep. It's not like antiquing is an 8th grader's idea of a thrilling evening. But Craig was enthralled. He had seen the craft one too many times. Craig was that weird kid that painted his fingernails black with Sharpie and drew pentagrams on his notebooks. Tom and I never minded Craig's oddities. We had all been friends since the sandbox and figured Craig was just going through an awkward phase. I mean, who wasn't back then? Craig made Tom tell the story over and over again, asking a million questions about Tom's tale. I jokingly referred to the whole thing as the spooky nap, but Craig was hooked, and I knew he was not going to stop until he found that stupid old book, which brings us back to this place. Too bad Tom couldn't remember what store his grandmother drove him to. I continued down the aisles, turning over the millionth knick-knack and casting a perfunctory glance at the handwritten price tag. John, it's it. I damn near dropped the stupid ceramic pig I was holding. Craig had instantly drawn many a passive-aggressive glance our way. Jesus, Craig. My harsh whisper snapped across the store, but Craig was not fazed. He just stood there, staring at the book with a dumb, gaping smile. My anger drained instantly. There was something so genuine in my friend's smile. I couldn't help but smile too. We pedaled our bikes up the hill and out of town, back to Craig's house. Craig powered up the incline as if finally finding that book had somehow made him lighter. The only thing that felt lighter to me was my own empty wallet. $65 for a moldy book? Craig only had $40 and begged me to cover the rest. 2 weeks of lawn mowing money gone just like that. He assured he'd pay me back. Well, at least I'm done antiquing, I thought, as I stood up to pedal through the steepest part of our ride. We dropped our bikes in the front lawn of Craig's house and ran up the stairs towards his room. His father yelled his usual, "Hello, boys," from his living room chair. Craig threw his bedroom door shut and ripped at the Jansport zipper. His urgency ground to a halt as he gently pulled the book from the backpack, almost as if he were a midwife pulling a baby into the world. He immediately began flipping through the pages as Tom had done in his story. Nothing happened though. No lost time, no spooky occurrences. I wasn't interested before, but I was now thoroughly wrapped up in Craig's enthusiasm. I held out my hand and felt the weight as Craig passed the tome. I peered at the aged leather cover and was flooded with anxiety. A feeling identical to the result of restlessly lying in bed late at night, contemplating the inevitability of death, and trying to futilely wrap your mind around the concept of nothingness for all eternity. I tried to push this dread from my mind. I placed the book on the carpet in front of us and opened it. We flipped through the pages in silence. Some portions of the book were so worn they could no longer be read, but one section remained pristine. The first word filled half a page with its fancy bold script. Chinor, we read unintentionally in unison. An almost poetic paragraph followed, indented and spaced to indicate flow. This must be what Tom thought was a song. Craig turned to the next page before I could finish reading the first. A sketch filled the next page. It appeared to be a symbol, but it looked much more like a graph from my algebra textbook. There was what I saw as a clear X and Y axis, X's at the O point, and at the ends of each axis line. A circle hung in the middle of the image with 2 horizontal lines emanating from the top and bottom of the circle and securing it to the Y-axis. Well, if it was a graph, I had no idea what it meant. I could hear Mrs. Linden's voice in my head, "Label your vertices." I was done with the book and already late getting back home. I left Craig there and told him to bring it to school tomorrow. I slept poorly that night. My dreams were troubled and the alley behind my house had apparently been conquered by a band of howling cats. At least tomorrow was Halloween and the school wouldn't be demanding much from us. I plopped down on the bench of our usual lunch table and began the ritual of sopping up the excess pizza grease with napkins. My tired mind drifted off as I observed the flood of bright orange expanding outwards through the white paper. Tom and Craig clanked their filled trays down onto the table, snapping me out of my greasy trance. Craig hadn't touched a single piece of food before he fished that book out from his bag. "So, I have an idea," Craig started. "I'm sure what we read last night was a summoning ritual. I say we do it tonight. Halloween." "What? No," Tom snapped. Weeks earlier, we had been invited over to the house of Tom's crush, Susie, to watch horror movies on Halloween. Her parents weren't going to be there, just the three of us, Susie and her friend Jane. Tom thought this was going to be his big chance with Susie. I was just excited to watch all the movies my parents would never allow, and Jane was kind of cool too. She reminded me of Daria. She even had the same glasses. Craig turned to Tom. "Look, we can bring the book over to Susie's and do it there. There's even a part where we have to hold hands." Craig winked at Tom. Watching Tom's face turn warm and pink, I knew there was no way he was going to pass up a perfect excuse to hold Susie's hand for an extended period of time. Why do we want to summon a demon?" I asked. "Aren't they evil and stuff?" Craig's eyes lit up. "That's the thing. This one, Chinor, he grants wishes to those that summon him. He normally lives in dreams, but rewards people that allow him to enter reality. So even if it works, nothing bad will happen." "Fine," I said. There would still be plenty of time to watch a few of the movies after they were done with this demon book business. Craig let out a "yes" and shook Tom by the shoulder. School let out early for Halloween. We met up with Susie and Jane behind the portable where all the cool kids smoked. All our parents thought we were staying at each other's houses. Tom and Susie exchanged awkward teenage glances while I chatted with Jane. Craig didn't appear interested in the conversation. He bounced in place, tightly grasping the straps to his backpack before breaking and interrupting us all. "You guys ready to go?" "Yup," Susie said, while still looking at Tom. Craig started walking off in the direction of Susie's place without ever looking back to see if we were there. It was a short walk to Susie's. 2 unlit jack-o'-lanterns flanked our doorstep. Jane pulled out her lighter and brought their glowing faces to life. I placed a plastic cauldron of candy on the porch with a hastily written "Take One" sign, sure to police the coming hordes of candy-craving children. Craig was already inside with Susie and Tom. My eyes came around the corner to the living room, just in time to witness Craig spill out the contents of that old Jansport. Thin wax candles clinked on the ground, along with a couple pieces of stolen chalk from Mrs. Lindson's blackboard. Last came the old book, slamming heavily on the hard wood. Craig grabbed a piece of the chalk and began to scrawl that strange symbol right on the wooden floor. "Hey!" Susie yelled. "That better wipe off." "Don't worry," Craig responded under his breath. "Do we have to do this now?" I asked. "Shouldn't we at least wait until it's dark out?" Craig stopped dragging the chalk across the floor, blankly stared off for far too long before agreeing. We started off the night with classics, Halloween and Nightmare on Elm Street. The sun was setting until about 6. Craig seemed to be watching the clock more than the movies. Tom had strategically chosen the middle seat on the couch, ensuring Susie would be sitting next to him. Friday the 13th had just started getting interesting when Craig unapologetically turned off the TV. "It's dark enough now," he proclaimed. No one objected. Craig finished his chalk drawing on the floor. He had Jane light the candles and handed us each one. We were instructed to sit in a circle around the symbol. Craig took his candle and held it at an angle. Wax dripped and pooled in front of him. Once the hot mound was large enough, he placed the base of the candle into it, securing it upright. The rest of us followed suit. The girls had already heard from Tom what we knew about Chinor, that he was a wish-granting demon and apparently not all that bad. According to Craig, we would first complete the ritual to bring Chinor into our world. His arrival would be heralded by the sound of Cats? I was pretty sure Craig had that part wrong. Anyway, once Chinora was here, we would take turns making a wish and then blow out our candles. When all the wishes were made, Chinora's debt to us would be paid, leaving him free to do whatever it is demons do. Our hands joined around the circle. I was unsettled by the transformation of my friends' familiar faces as the candlelight danced across their features. It began to rain before Craig had said a single word. We uncomfortably exchanged looks and crippled laughs. Craig began with a confident tone that betrayed his youth. It was clear he had memorized this portion of the script. He had already told us we needed to recite the lines 3 times, uninterrupted, or it wouldn't work. Craig spoke, and we repeated. Chinor, weak of body and strong of mind, eye of gold and wealth of time, join me here and share what's mine. Worlds for wish, bind, bind, bind. Cats could be heard crying out in the rain as we neared the beginning of our 3rd round of chanting. Craig must have sensed we were all starting to chicken out. His eyes opened wider, giving us all the "don't screw this up" look, while he continued to chant the words. We reached the last bind, 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 and the cats fell silent. Craig started looking around the room as if he expected some demon to be standing behind us. We remained holding hands until the awkwardness of the situation overcame our 14-year-old selves. I let go of Jane and Craig's hands. Craig left the circle and started flipping through that smelly old book that cost him a small fortune in middle school dollars. Jane plucked her candle from its melted stand and said, "I wish I didn't need glasses," then blew out the flame. No one saw that coming. We all stared at her as if some shimmering light were about to materialize and grant her perfect vision. Jane's face went blank. Her eyes locked on nothing as she cautiously removed her black-framed glasses. She slowly looked down to her glasses, then back up. I can see! Jane screamed. "Oh my god, seriously?" Susie said as she grabbed Jane's arm. Jane's lips curled into a mischievous smirk. Susie slapped at and missed a now sprinting Jane. The girls ran circles through the house and playfully squealed. I couldn't help but smile at those two. The joy blackened as I found Tom's face. His gaze was locked outside, and true horror was reflected in his expression. I jumped up from the circle to see what Tom saw. I was prepared for my old friend to be pulling a fast one on me. Taking a page out of Jane's playbook, Craig walked over and joined as I caught a sight of it. An emaciated and drenched boy was stumbling his way across Susie's sprawling backyard. He could only manage a few steps before falling to a knee. The boy gathered his strength, pushed the ground away, and kept walking towards the house. "Okay, very funny, Craig," I said. "Which one of your friends did you pay to scare us?" Craig didn't respond. He didn't need to. His face now mirrored Tom's. The girls' fun must have been interrupted by our silence. They poked their heads between us to look outside. The boy was much closer now. "Is that a skeleton costume he's wearing?" Susie asked. "Yeah, and I think he's drunk too," I replied. Craig snapped out of his trance and added, "Maybe he's hurt." I started to turn to reassure Tom when the boy had made it close enough for me to realize he wasn't wearing a costume. Ribs covered in brown, red blood were punching through the boy's sides and wrapped around his torso. One eye appeared stuffed open by an oversized prosthetic. The creature's movements grew jerky. He snapped his arms and legs about as he shuffled his way closer. I watched it fall once more, now only feet away from the house. Jane began to scream, first normally, then descending to a low, booming howl. She stared into my eyes, then plunged 2 fingers from each hand into her own. Fluids burst onto her cheeks as Jane dug and scooped out her own eye sockets. Her rumbling yell carried on as her mouth opened wider and wider. A snapping sound like breaking a carrot pierced her cry. Her jaw had fractured. Her screaming mouth now fell wider. The terrible sound ended abruptly and Jane fell to the floor, dead. She doesn't need glasses now, Craig timidly spoke. What? I yelled. My anger was splintered by the thud of flesh on the glass. The creature was now at the rear sliding door. Blow out the candles, Tom screamed. Without thought, we converged on the circle and extinguished our flames. I turned to look at the door. The thing was gone. We all kept in touch, but things were never the same after that night. The coroner concluded Jane died of a sudden aneurysm. He said it was possible the pressure on her brain caused the self-destructive behavior in her final moments. I think Jane's death hit Susie and I the hardest. It brought us together in a way Tom seemed to quietly resent. I went through the motions, school, home, school, and the seasons cycled again as they have always done. Halloween came again. I stayed home that year. My mother tried to cheer me up. She laid out all the tools to carve pumpkins and encouraged me. I picked up a knife to cut the lid and caught a glimpse of her warm smile. Her child was finally doing something other than quietly sitting in his room. At first, I started to cut in the pumpkin for my mother's sake, but as I continued, I found the spirit that made this my favorite holiday. How long was I going to let a freak medical occurrence ruin my life? That's all it had really been, right? The kitchen phone rang. My mother subtly gestured for me to keep carving as she made her way to answer it. I was hardly listening but made out, "Hello? What? Are you sure? You too." She sat down next to me and stilled my hand. "Honey, Craig died tonight." I looked up from my orange mess. I was not surprised. I knew it wasn't over yet. There was no chance of sleeping that night. The cats were howling again. And so it has happened every Halloween since. Next was Tom, then Susie. Every year, Chinor comes to settle his debt. We all owed him wishes that we dared not to make. I'm the last. I've had 4 years to plan for what's coming this Halloween, and perhaps I might live to see another. The cats are silent now. You see, I drew the symbol, I said the words, I made my wish, and I blew out the candle. I'm sorry, but this is the only way. Maybe you can find more honorable means to save yourself than I did. I've wished that my wish be given to the last one to read my tale before the end of this Halloween. I'm 18 years old. I don't want to die. This incident happened to me last year on Halloween. My brother and I were home alone since our parents had gone out to a Halloween party. They had tasked us with handing out candy to the trick-or-treaters. This bummed my brother and I out because we had made plans to go trick-or-treating with our friends. Our parents told us that we were too old to still be trick-or-treating and that we could instead invite our friends over to the house and hang out there. My friends declined my invitation to come over because they still wanted to go trick-or-treating, so that left me home alone with my brother handing out candy. A lot of people stopped by our house, and by 10, almost all of the candy was gone. My brother and I decided that we'd eat the rest. We were sitting on the couch, watching a scary movie, stuffing ourselves with candy when there was a knock at the door. I stormed off the couch wondering who the hell could be knocking on our door this late. I assumed that it was just some late night trick-or-treaters. Even if that was the case, I had turned the porch light and Halloween decorations off, which should have been a dead giveaway that we were out of candy or that we weren't home, so I assumed it was my parents. Being cautious, I looked through the peephole and saw a suspicious man standing on our front porch. He was wearing a black hoodie with the hood over his head, which made it difficult to see his face. The only detail of his face I could spot was that he had a beard and dry, crusty lips. There was no way that this guy was a trick-or-treater because he wasn't wearing a costume and was far too old to be trick-or-treating alone. His hands were stuffed in the front pocket of his hoodie, and he also looked very thin. Every single red flag went off in my head about this guy. There was no way in hell I was going to open the door. Still looking through the peephole, I watched as he knocked on the door again. He seemed desperate for us to open the door and was shaking a bit. It wasn't cold outside, definitely not cold enough for someone to be trembling. He was giving me a bad vibe, and I wanted to get rid of him as soon as possible. "We're out of candy," I shouted. I watched as a smile spread across his face. It wasn't a friendly smile either. "Are you alone in there?" "Should I call the police?" my little brother asked me quietly, gripping the cell phone. The man let out a low grumble and said, "Sounds like you're not in there alone." I continued to watch him through the peephole. His hands were still wedged tightly in his pocket, and he was still shaking a bit. I began to wonder if he was armed. I decided to take action and spoke to him in the most intimidating voice I could. "Get away from our house, or I'll call the police." His smile faded, and he bared his teeth. His teeth were piss yellow, and I concluded that he was probably some homeless crackhead. He had a look of fury plastered on his face. Fortunately, he left without trying to break in, probably because he knew I wasn't messing around with him. I didn't stop watching him through the peephole until I saw him completely off of our property. My brother and I breathed a sigh of relief and decided not to call the police. My brother and I were a bit paranoid after this and watched TV until our parents came home. We didn't tell them about the man since he hadn't really tried to harm us. Now, when I think back to this, I wish we had called the police because maybe we could have been able to prevent a murder. You see, the next day, we found out that the elderly woman who lived a few houses down from us had been brutally murdered. Her neighbor had found her lying on her front porch, covered in blood. She had been stabbed multiple times in the chest and neck. My brother and I immediately knew who had done it, and we told the police what we knew. They couldn't do much from the information we had given them, since we hadn't seen many details of the face. They went on to hunt for the man, but they never caught him. I blame myself for that poor old lady's murder, because I could have prevented it from happening just by calling the police. I think the most disturbing thing of all of this is the fact that he didn't take anything from the old lady's house. Her house had been left untouched, but he could have gone in and taken what he wanted since her door was wide open. This means that he just wanted to kill. That was his only intention. He didn't want money or jewelry, he only had an urge to murder. So, to the creepy crackhead Halloween slasher, let's not meet. Mandy watched the girl on the television run. She was about 30 minutes into Halloween, and honestly, she was unimpressed. Was this really what she was staying up past her bedtime for? Was this really worth the risk of her mother finding out that she was not in fact really asleep, preparing for the next day in which she would go to school and learn just like the good children do? Mandy was only 10, but scary movies fascinated her enough that she decided, yes, this was worth it. It was worth every minute of watching the young girls run on the screen. They were usually blonde, with big chests that nearly popped out of their shirts as they frantically tried to escape the guy with the knife. But it was funny to Mandy, because the guy with the knife never seemed to be chasing them. No, he was simply walking after them. She supposed that when people were truly afraid of you, you didn't need to try. They would do something stupid and slip up, and you would catch them. And then after that was Mandy's favorite part. After that was when the pretty girls got tackled to the ground and the man in the mask would stick his knife right into them. He never hesitated. He was too confident about what he was doing. He knew exactly where to cut them too. Sometimes he toyed with them, letting their blood spill into their eyes as he cut them again. Or maybe he even just hit them. He never spoke. He didn't need to either. He was the master, and they were his puppets. Mandy thought about it for a second, and she smiled to herself. Even if it was just a movie, she found that she could admire him. Actually, she thought it was a little bit more than admiration. She didn't want to be like him either. She wasn't just idolizing him, but somewhere in her 10-year-old mind, she wanted to be him. But she knew that it was impossible. There was no way she could ever actually be Michael Myers. She would have to settle for second best, Mandy Wilson. She thought that sounded good to the ears, but at the same time, she knew it wasn't the same. So, she would really have to kick it up a notch when deciding who she was going to toy with first. Now, these ideas weren't out of nowhere. In fact, they had been a long time coming, you see, because Mandy Wilson loathed everyone at her elementary school, especially the captain of the blue team in her gym class. All Mandy had wanted to do was be the girl's friend, but to no avail. The girl, who went by Claire Robertson, never paid any mind to Mandy, and Mandy would get put on the red team by default. She didn't know why she had originally wanted to be Claire's friend. All she knew now was that because she couldn't be, Claire was going to have to pay a very big price. The thought made Mandy smile as she slipped on brown Uggs and a darker brown parka. She didn't care that it was almost 10 at night. Claire lived in the same town, and it was better to use the element of surprise anyway, right? It wasn't like she could very well risk doing it in the broad daylight, since her mother would never let her out of the door to begin with. She smiled wider. She even knew where Claire's room was, so, for her first time, this was easy as pie. All she would have to do was get through the window. It would be ideal if it was unlocked, but if it wasn't, she would have to risk breaking and entering, because this was going to happen. She pulled her own jet black hair into a tight ponytail and then slipped out of her bedroom into the hallway. The only sound to be heard in the entire house was from the bedroom next door to hers, and it was the soft snores of her father, along with the faint drone of Saturday Night Live. Mandy was happy at these results and tiptoed down the stairs, feeling along the railing, as her eyes have not adjusted to the dark yet. Lucky for her, her stairs were brand new, and for now, going down them resulted in no noise at all. She would go unnoticed. All it took was the simple unlocking of the door at the bottom of said stairs, and then she was going out into the cold night air. Once outside, she was happy to see the shears her mother used on the hedges were still sitting on the porch steps. She would hate to risk going back inside, at least not yet. She didn't really care how much trouble she got into after this was over, but for at least once in her life, she was going to be who she thought Mandy Wilson was born to be. She grabbed the shears and held them behind her back for protection, though she didn't think she would need to. The street was bare too. It was full of houses which Mandy was sure were full of sleeping people, all getting ready for the next day, and having no idea what she was up to. In fact, it almost seemed like the houses were watching her. Their dark eyes followed her down the street until she got to the very end, that is. She was surprised that she didn't see a single person. It was almost like the fates wanted this to happen. At least, that was how it seemed to her. And then she saw Claire's house. It was a cobblestone, just like hers. Only this one only had one floor and no gate. Like the rest of the houses, this one was dark, suggesting that everyone inside was sleeping. Mandy approached the window to the room she knew was Claire's. Her heart was thumping in her chest, and despite the chill of the wind, she could feel her palms sweating as she gripped the wooden handle of the shears. This window was the kind that you would just jump in and it would open. So, holding her breath, she tried. And it worked, almost flawlessly, except for the enormous creak that it made. Mandy ducked down, trying to, at the same time, to keep an eye on the still figure across the room in the bed. It was Claire, of course, and she remained still. Mandy didn't want to wait anymore, nor did she want to risk closing the window and having it squeak again. So, she hastily climbed through. Claire still did not stir from her sleep, not even as Mandy stood over her, eyes adjusting to the darkness yet again. She could see the shallow rise and fall of the other girl's chest. It was exactly the motivation she needed, though, as she raised the shears. Claire opened her eyes just as the blades were brought down on her throat. All she got out was a hoarse croak as she looked into the eyes of Mandy Wilson, and blood sprayed the crazed girl's face. She was smiling as she pulled the shears back out. The sound of the suction was like music to her ears. The sound of the suction was like music to her ears. The sight of the sticky crimson on the shiny blade was pure art to her. But there was nothing better than watching the girl before her twitch and struggle to make a sound as her lungs began to fill with her own blood. Claire's eyes had glazed over as they fought to keep the light in them. But Mandy knew it was fading, and it was too easy. Angry about how easy this had been, she brought the shears down again, almost laughing at the gushing noise it made as more blood oozed out. She could feel it drying on her own skin, and absent-mindedly licked it off her upper lip. The coppery liquid was sweeter than to be expected. She pressed them down more, and for the final time, with a grunt. The other girl wheezed in a desperate attempt to fight back, but it was a futile attempt. Claire's body went limp, and Mandy was furious. She didn't get to play with her the way she had pictured, but really, that was okay, because no one would suspect a 10-year-old girl of this. Never. Mandy would take a lesson from this, because it would not be the last time, and she made that clear, as she took the shears and forced them into the girl's exposed stomach. More blood pooled as she carved her initials. For good measure, she added a smiley face. It was Halloween 2016, and I decided to take a walk with my friends Vincent and Austin. Vincent is a tough kid who doesn't get scared too easily, and Austin is more of a brave kid who's not necessarily tough. I'm also a pretty brave kid who doesn't get scared unless I feel like I'm in danger. I was 14 when this happened, and this is easily the scariest thing to ever happen to the three of us. We decided to take a walk after we finished our trick-or-treating session. Nothing significant happened while we were trick-or-treating. We just enjoyed ourselves, not worrying about anything at all. Considering that Vincent and Austin were both 13 and I was 14, we weren't nearly as interested in trick-or-treating as we were when we were younger, but we still did it, because honestly it was still pretty fun. It was 9:30 at night when we decided to take a 30-minute walk, and we had our cell phones with us so we could text our parents just in case anything happened. The first couple of minutes of the walk went by smoothly. During that time, we were basically telling each other inappropriate jokes and laughing like complete retards. A few minutes into our walk, just as we were leaving our neighborhood, I could have sworn that I heard a peculiar noise coming from the bushes. It sounded like some sort of rustling, like something was in there. I told my friends about the sound, and they just dismissed as being an animal moving around in the bushes. I agreed, and we proceeded with our walk. Just a few moments later, I started to feel like I was being watched by something. Again, I notified my friends about how I felt, and they both told me that they felt the same way as I did. At this point, we were approaching the main road. This road is usually very busy during the day, but it's almost dead at night. It was much quieter than normal during our walk, which only made things worse. We still felt like we were being watched, but all three of us dismissed it as a false alarm. A few minutes passed, and all of a sudden, I heard quiet footsteps coming from behind us. This is where things got weird. My friends obviously weren't paying attention, as they were both looking at each other, laughing and telling each other stupid jokes that weren't even funny. Before I explain what happens next, let me give you a basic explanation of our surroundings. This is a main road, so of course, there's a sidewalk next to the road. There also happens to be a patch of grass between 10 and 15 feet wide that separates the sidewalk from the road. Suddenly, a man in an oversized white robe comes running at full speed parallel to us, passing us as my friends are cracking up laughing. I mean it when I say that the robe was oversized. The man was 6 feet tall and very thin, but it looked like he was wearing at least an XXL. The man also looked like he was part of some sort of deranged cult, and we decided to trail behind him and follow him without him noticing. We stopped following him after about 10 seconds, and we even laughed about the way he was running. The robe was very long, so long that it looked very dangerous to be running at that kind of speed. At this point, I knew for a fact that this man was not dressing up for Halloween and showing off. If that's what he was doing, he would have done it in a much better area that's filled with people at night. Seriously, who dresses up for Halloween in the middle of nowhere and runs around like a complete lunatic? That's what my friends and I were wondering. Once I mentioned that this man isn't dressing up for Halloween, we started to realize how fishy this whole situation was starting to become. This is where we started to become much more serious about our surroundings. We weren't joking around anymore. All we wanted to do was get out of there. We decided not to text our parents because we didn't want to worry them, which wasn't the best idea when I look back on it. We turned around because we were getting hungry and we needed to go home to eat something. As we were walking down the quiet main road, the rustling of the bushes sent chills down our spines. It couldn't have been the robes guy because he was too far away by the time we heard the rustling. We all looked at each other, panicking, and Vincent even told me that we needed to get home quick. Again, Vincent is a tough kid, and even he was starting to worry. I told my friends that we wouldn't run unless something else happened during our walk home. At this point, we were only about 8 minutes away from my house. This next part still gives us nightmares to this day, and I feel very uncomfortable talking about it. We were turning left on the street that takes us back to our neighborhood, and we even felt as if something would happen any second. We were right. All of a sudden, we heard a man screaming at the top of his lungs off in the distance. The three of us had the guts to look in the direction of the scream. What we saw made our hearts drop into our stomachs. About 500 feet away, on the neighboring street opposite to our own, was the black figure, just standing there. We decided to stare at the figure for a few seconds, and we could tell that its head was not facing us. My gut suddenly told me that we were being stared at by something else, and my friends seemed to agree with me about that. We were really scared, and we had no idea what we were supposed to do next. Our hearts were racing as we saw the figure turn its head into our direction, and as it turned its head, we heard another noise coming from the bushes. Our hearts were beating over 200 beats per minute. We immediately booked it out of there as fast as we could, and we were continuously looking over our shoulders as we ran. We were already back in my house within a minute, and that was probably the fastest we have ever ran in our lives. When we arrived back at the house, we looked behind us, and we saw that nobody was there. We were relieved that we were not being followed, or maybe we were being followed, and they gave up after they found out we were too fast. I made a sigh of relief as I said goodbye to Austin, who was tired and he wanted to get ready for bed. After that, I said goodbye to Vincent, whose parents drove him home because he didn't live in a neighborhood like Austin. After those events, I told my parents that something weird happened that night. I never told them the whole story until recently, and that was a good idea looking back at things. I ate some food and went to bed around 11:30. But the story didn't end there. I woke up in the middle of the night. It was around 1:30 in the morning, a time that I'm never usually up. Once I remembered the events of the previous night, I began to feel like I was being watched, even in the safety of my own home. My gut was telling me to look out the window, but I was seriously questioning whether or not I should. I finally had the courage to look out my window. I opened the blinds and I saw a red car blocking someone's driveway about 150 feet down the road. The car looked very suspicious, and I had never seen that car before. It looked like some sort of a Chevy from the early 2000s. Not even 5 seconds after that, I opened the blinds. Whoever was in the car floored it down the road and never looked back. I still live in that same house that I've lived in since 2012. I believe that this car definitely had something to do with the events that occurred that night. I have not seen that red car ever since, and nothing else has happened to me.